Greetings, children of eternal hope and servants of a living King. There are quite a few things I'd like to read to you today. In fact, I have had to shave it down to the most important things if I expect anyone to sit all the way through to the end. But I feel that it is very important to expose some of the things that have been hidden. You might have heard people complain throughout the last few decades that the curriculum that we teach our children, especially in the humanities, has been changed or watered down. A casual viewing of the material might not be able to detect the change. Certain truths, like the date of the signing of the Declaration of Independence or the battles and states that were involved in the Civil War, are all accurate and properly identified. When you hear someone complain that the curriculum has been changed, it is that they rightly feel that the spirit or the modus operandi of the events has either been changed or removed altogether from the texts. In other words, the history is accurate, but the logos, or the reason of the history, has been intentionally hidden from us. With the separation of church and state being reinterpreted nearly 150 years after the fact, to mean, and it has been reinterpreted to mean, a harsh and vicious divorce of wisdom from the public square, the reason for things, if that reason was the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ and its impact on the thinking and morals of mankind, was stripped out of the thinking process of the public square. In other words, you have a history of people being taught that many good things happened in history, but you are not told about the spirit through which those good things arose. And the education system has done such a good job at ignoring these truths that many products of its system feel smugly secure in their ignorance of the things of Christ. It should be the endeavor and mission of the church to correct this incredible lack of insight at every turn possible, which means that we must study to show ourselves approved. For it is this insight that endows each person with the dignity and rights that Marx, Mao, and Hitler, to cover all political spectrums, would destroy in order to retain their power over the people. Or like Nimrod, so many centuries ago, would like to turn every one of God's children into equal-sized bricks with which to build Babel anew. For if we allow the enemy to remove God and Christ from everything just because it makes some people uncomfortable to admit that there is an authority in heaven and that he decides morals and laws, then we also must scratch out what has preserved our society for so long and ignorantly hope that the building will stand after kicking the foundation out from under it. And that the founding fathers, whatever gripe you might have about them as individuals, had the wisdom and intelligence to inscribe forever the foundation on which this great country was built. Let me read the preamble to you real quick. Abraham Lincoln called it a rebuke and a stumbling block to tyranny and oppression. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident. You know the rest. Last night I had an extremely vivid dream. It was Dickensian, to say the least, very reminiscent of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I've been fascinated with Paul's statement about our pitifulness if Jesus has indeed not risen from the grave. In preacher school, there were certain authors I ran into while studying soteriology, or the study of our salvation, that seemed to think that if Christ's body was found, that it really wouldn't change anything for the church. St. Paul would have found these scholars to be the height of ignorance and folly, as do I. In my dream, I was taken by the ghost of No Christmas Ever to a school setting in our current day and time. He told me to watch and pay attention, this angel. It was at that moment that a young boy sitting in the class asked the teacher about some disaster that happened on the playground. I couldn't quite grasp what was being said, but suffice it to say that the boy was looking for some way to ethically and morally deal with an injustice that he had played a part in. He told his teacher that his parents had taught him something ancient, something almost unknown nowadays, called the Golden Rule. The teacher smirked at him and asked whom his parents attributed this nonsense. The boy, very innocently, told her that they attributed it to Jesus Christ of Nazareth. With hate and scorn in her voice, the teacher rolled her eyes and proceeded to tell the child the ironic story of the dead Nazarene. As the teacher told this nightmare story, the angel grabbed the nape of my neck and flew me to the four corners of the world, where I saw a world I did not recognize. The whole time I could hear the teacher berating the student with a cautionary tale of the dead Son of God. The world I saw had never stopped offering its babies to Molech. It had never stopped putting children on the doorsteps to die from exposure when they were a nuisance. It never started an education system to give everyone an opportunity to grow. Slavery was never seen as dehumanizing. And the teacher went on and on to tell the child that if Jesus taught us anything, it was that no good deed went unpunished. He healed people and was ran out of town. He gave sight to the blind only to have the church plot his demise. He told people to give to Caesar what was Caesar's, but Caesar could not stand that he was not getting God's portion as well. So even the state went after this nuisance of a man. The great story that you and I know of the risen Savior, if Jesus has not risen from the dead, becomes a cautionary tale, a tale of irony, to let children know that they should look out for number one. They better get theirs before anybody else does. That everything is buyer beware, and that the ends always justify the means. To sacrifice anything for anyone else is a fool's game. And the story of Jesus dead in his grave is the ultimate wisdom, to make sure your children don't get walked on and taken advantage of. In the dream, I was then taken back to the classroom, where I wept as the angel whispered in my ear, "If Christ is not risen, then we are to be pitied above all men." I would like to read you an article by Scott Powell, who is a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute in Seattle. This article was published in the Washington Times and describes the impact of the risen Savior Jesus Christ on the world that we know now. He writes, "For Christians, Christmas is a unique time of joy associated with the birth of the Savior Jesus, whose life, death, and resurrection makes possible a personal and intimate relationship with God. Jesus was born a Jew, and his teachings were built on the foundation of Torah and the Old Testament. And so it is that Christians and Jews have much in common and share a natural mutual affinity. Christians and Jews have both faced persecution throughout history, and hostility is again intensifying. And that persecution comes not just from radical Islamists, but also from secular progressives who now dominate Western culture. Various towering intellectuals even wish that Christ had never been born. Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche, who separately inspired and influenced the rise of murderous totalitarian regimes in Russia and Germany, both condemned Christianity and religion in general. For Marx, religion was the opium of the people. Nietzsche said Christianity was the greatest of all imaginable corruptions. It's a Wonderful Life is an American film classic enjoyed by more during the Christmas season today than when it first came out in 1946. Directed by the legendary Frank Capra, the film is an otherworldly story revolving around a main character played by Jimmy Stewart in a narrative showing what life would have been like if he had never been born. Similarly, since Capra's collective cinematographic works exhibit a profoundly Christian vision, it's worth extrapolating on how history and the present would be different if Christ had never been born. History shows that the Christian church has brought about more changes for the advancement and benefit of people than any other force or movement. Non-believing, secular-minded people might be surprised by the myriad achievements by committed Christians, progressive accomplishments that they too celebrate. Before Christ, human life was cheap and expendable all over the world. In the Americas, the Near East, Africa, the Middle East, and the Far East, child sacrifice was a common phenomenon. Babies, particularly females, who were considered inferior, were regularly abandoned. Arthur George Grant points out, before the explosion and penetrating growth of medieval Christian influence, the primordial evils of abortion, infanticide, abandonment, and exposure were a normal part of everyday life. That changed in the West with the 6th century Christian Byzantine Roman Emperor Justinian, whatever you think of him, whose law code declared child abandonment and abortion a crime. In ancient cultures, in India, China, Rome, and Greece, women were considered inferior and simply viewed as property of their husbands. More recently, in the last 2.5 centuries, with the advent of the Christian missionary movement, the lives of women have been greatly improved. Countless female infants abandoned in China were saved from almost sure death by Christian missionaries who then protected, educated, and raised them in Christian orphanages. In India, prior to Christian influence, elderly widows were burned alive on their husbands' funeral pyres, while infanticide, particularly for girls, was practiced by tossing little ones into the sea. In Africa, wives and concubines of tribal chieftains were routinely killed after the latter's death. These practices were greatly ameliorated or entirely stopped as Christianity began to penetrate and influence the respective cultures. Slavery is still practiced in parts of the Middle East and Africa, but it has been abolished throughout the Western world primarily due to leadership and influence of Christians. 2,000 years ago, Apostle Paul was way before his time, stating in his letter to Philemon that he should receive his former slave as a brother beloved. The establishment of hospitals and universities, which began in the Middle Ages, were exclusively undertaken by Christians. The Christian Renaissance inspired more of the world's greatest and most valuable art than any other period in history. Campaigns for literacy and education for the masses that came several centuries later were also undertaken almost exclusively by Christians. While some may feel the United States was slow to abolish slavery and elevate women, its Christian founders were wise in instituting a constitution that provided for change to enable the country to fulfill the Declaration of Independence, in which all people were declared equal and endowed by their Creator, not the state, with certain unalienable rights. that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That Constitution assures that the promise of equal opportunity would reach greater fullness with time. Christian women were most influential in getting child labor laws passed. Methodist Frances Willard inspired millions of Americans to support women's right to vote, which was enshrined in the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. The civil rights movement of the later half of the 20th century was inspired and led by American Baptist minister, the Reverend Martin Luther King. While modernity has made many of us impatient, Dr. King probably would not have imagined how quickly his people would advance. In just 40 years, blacks have achieved commensurate success with whites in every field, including reaching the presidency of the United States of America. Suffice it to say that life both at home and around the world would no doubt be qualitatively worse today if Christ had never been born and Christianity had never become the greatest spiritual force ever to advance the care and development of people. Indeed, there is reason to sing, "Joy to the world. He is risen. He is risen indeed." And folks, I'd love to keep going, but time is short and attention span's shorter. So here's a short section of Lewis describing the events right after Aslan's murder on the ancient table. "What's that?" said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. "I feel afraid to turn around," said Susan. "Something awful's happening." "They're doing something worse to him," said Lucy. "Come on." And she turned, pulling Susan round with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All the colors and shadows were changed, that for a moment they didn't see the important thing. And then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end, and there was no Aslan on it. Oh, cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. "Oh, it's too bad," sobbed Lucy. "They might have left the body alone." "Who's done it?" cried Susan. "What does it mean? Is it more magic?" "Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. "It is more magic." They looked round. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown out again, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan!" cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. "You're not a..." asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real! You're real! Oh, Aslan!" cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. "But what does it all mean?" asked Susan, when they were somewhat calmer. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time, but if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. And now..." "Oh, yes, now," said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can." He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table, laughing, though she didn't know why. Lucy scrambled over it to reach him. Aslan leapt again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws, and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly, so that all three of them rolled over together in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one has ever had except in Narnia. And whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. Brother and sister, our King is alive and well. You ask me how I know he lives. Because I see the evidence of his life and spirit in the very fabric of history itself. All good things have come from his command and have come from his hand. We have had him so long we have forgotten what the world looks like without him. The world has forgotten its first love. Let us be his tireless messengers whose life's ambition is to deliver Jesus' love letter to the world. Blessings to you all, and I hope to see you soon.